Today's lesson is from Luke chapter 14. Table talk, the dictionary definition, the informal conversation at a dining table, especially the social talk of some well-known person that is being recorded for publication. Today's lesson is the table talk of incidents that happened when Jesus was the dinner guest of a leading Pharisee. His conversation was about leaving Jerusalem desolate. His pointed remarks that the root of Israel's problems lay with her Pharisee leaders, and then his rationale for excluding many Jews from the kingdom and including the Gentiles. From chapter 11 that we studied, verses 53 and 54, we know that the Pharisees had already decided to do away with Jesus. So beginning in verse 1, one Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, I doubt that any Pharisee ever invited Jesus back to his house for a second dinner. Every time Jesus opened his mouth, he disclosed the hypocrisy in their heart, and he touched on the most fundamental issues of the soul. So when Jesus spoke, he always divided people between those who accepted his truth and those who rejected it. It says the Pharisees were watching him carefully. All of the vultures needed now was an opportunity to pounce on their prey. And views of the Sabbath were a major source of disagreement between Jesus and the Pharisees. Quite possibly this leading Pharisee, perhaps he was a member of the Sanhedrin, had intentionally set a trap for Jesus by inviting him to his house for a Sabbath meal. Jesus was already well known for violating Sabbath traditions on at least 7 other different occasions that we know about. And while the table fellowship implied friendship, this was clearly hypocritical on this occasion. Verse 2, and behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy. So it was very common for local townspeople to stand around and observe at a meal, especially when there was a guest of note, and even more especially when the guest was a rabbi. And Jesus responded to the lawyers and the Pharisees, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? As we might say today, the ball's in your court. What are you going to do about it? So Jesus goes on the offense right away. But they remained silent. Then he took him and healed him and sent him away. So Jesus makes an in-your-face move to force the conversation over their silence. And then he sends the man away so he's not involved in the controversy. And then he said to them, which of you have a son or an ox that has fallen into the well on Sabbath day and will not immediately pull him out? So he's pointed out that they're quick to take care of themselves and their own, but what about all these other poor people that God loves? And they could not reply to these things. So Jesus proceeded to show the logic of his action. The Old Testament and the rabbinic tradition permitted him to save a son or even an animal in such a situation. And Jesus implied that this sick man belonged to him, which was the case since Jesus is the possessor of heaven and earth. But his critics had no reply since Jesus' logic was irrefutable. Besides, they already knew what he believed about the relative importance of helping people and observing the Sabbath. So as the table talk continues, we find Jesus exerting his authority as a rabbi, which had been given him by the silence of the Pharisees' detractors on that last subject. So Jesus now proceeds to undress the pride of the Pharisees' dinner guest with a lesson on the importance of humility. And he explains that this lesson is important to understand the relationship to God as well as to their fellow man. So in verse 7, now he told a parable to those who were invited when he noticed how they chose the place of honor. So Jesus is sitting there watching the dinner guests as they come in. He always watches, even today. He wants to see what people love because he knows where their treasure is, their heart is. And he sees that these people love the praise of men. Customarily, people reclined on low couches for important meals such as this one, resting on their left sides. Where a person lay around the table indicated his status. In the typical U-shape arrangement, the closer the person was to the host, the one who reclined at the center or bottom of the U, the higher his status or the higher his place of honor. And Jesus' fellow guests had all tried to get the places of honor that were closest to the host to showcase their own importance. So in verse 7, now he told a parable to those who were invited when he noticed how they chose the place of honor, saying to them, when you're invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in a place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him. And he who invited you both will come and say to you, give up your place to this person, and then you will begin with shame to take the lowest place. Now, the lowest place was usually the only one left because all the others had been taken as the room filled up. But when you're invited, go and sit at the lowest place, so that when the host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. The world generally has no tolerance of proud people, but what is important is, what does Jesus think? What does Jesus think about the guest whose treasure is the praise of men? In short, he thinks they'll go to hell if their values don't change. Jesus spoke in two other places about this form of idolatry. In Luke 11, he says, woe to you Pharisees, for you love the best seat in the synagogue and salutations in the marketplace. And then in Luke 20, he says, beware of the scribes who like to go about in long robes and love salutation in the marketplace and the best seats in the synagogue and the places of honor at the feast, who also devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. So Jesus says two things go hand in hand with loving the place of honor at the feast. One is a personal characteristic as one who's willing to exploit the weak, and another is a heart that is condemned already. If your treasure is the praise of men and a widow's house stands in your way, you would just destroy it. He says, but in the end, you're condemned by God's judgment. So Jesus says here, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Jesus' teaching was never simply ethical. It always had a spiritual dimension, and Jesus was teaching on both levels. If the Pharisees didn't perceive, or if they rejected the lesson about Jesus' ministry, they could at least profit from his ethical instructions. And if Jesus hadn't ruffled enough feathers already at the meal, he continues by exposing the lawyers' ability to twist the law to protect their own self-interest. Verse 12, he said also to the man who had invited him, when you give a dinner or a banquet, don't just invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or the rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you'll be repaid. Jesus doesn't intend to end all family meals and gatherings of friends, but the truth is, there is in every human heart a terrible and a powerful tendency to live by the law of earthly repayment or the law of reciprocity. He says, but when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and then you will be blessed because they can't repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. So the principle that Jesus recommended to his host for selecting guests is the same one that God used in inviting people to his messianic banquet, inviting those who couldn't repay. The favor resulted in greater glory for the earthly host as well as glory for God. Jesus says it really does matter who you invite to your banquets. Why didn't the rich man let poor man Lazarus eat the crumbs from his table? Because Lazarus couldn't pay him back. If earthly hosts behave as the heavenly host, he says that behavior demonstrates true righteousness, and God will reward it. Otherwise, they only receive the earthly reward from their guest. Verse 15. When one of those who reclined at table with him heard these things, he said to him, Blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God. So one of the men at the table made an assumption that he was one of the blessed that Jesus is referring to. And this opened it up for Jesus to tell another parable that characterizes a vast majority of the world and clarifies who will be invited to his banquet of grace and goodness, love and mercy, and all of the bounties of life. But he said to him, a man, speaking of God, once gave a great banquet and invited many. And at the time for the banquet, he sent his servant, speaking of Jesus, to say to those who had been invited, speaking of the Jews, Come, for everything is now ready. Now, big banquets require a lot of time and preparation, and God's been preparing for this messianic banquet for centuries. But they all alike began to make excuses. For example, the first said to him, I've bought a field and I must go and see it. I've paid good money for this property and I haven't seen it yet. Please have me excused. A bad excuse is worse than none at all. And another said, I've bought 5 yoke of oxen and I've got to go examine them. I paid good money for these 5 yoke of oxen and I still need to find out if they can plow or not. Please have me excused. Sometimes when people do not have truth as a resource for their raw material, they can always make one out of a lie. And another said, I have married a wife, and she's got this to-do list a mile long for me, or she won't come with me. Whatever, he blames it on her, and therefore I cannot come. Now, the first 2 made pretense with apology, but the third didn't beat around the bush. He says, I cannot come. He didn't need an excuse. He just wasn't coming. What kind of priorities do people have to decline the invitation to the great banquet of God? Work, they're too busy. Possessions, pleasure, lack of interest. How is it that men can know of God and know of the gospel and all the good things that God has to offer, freely given away, and yet refuse them? The plain and simple answer is found in an Old Testament prophet by the name of Zechariah. In the 3rd chapter of his book, in the 1st verse, it says, And God showed me Joshua, the high priest, standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to resist him. That's why whenever a man comes face to face with God and the Lord appeals to his heart, right there by the side of that man is Satan, trying to undo every invitation God gives and trying to repudiate every invitation the Lord makes. So while God is pleading, Satan is resisting, And he's saying all kinds of things in your heart why it is you ought not to respond. So the servant came and reported these things to his master. So like this servant, every good servant of the Master Jesus should report the results of the mission that he or she has been given. Sometimes that report is good, sometimes it's bad. Then the master of the house became angry. After all that work, after all that sacrificial preparation, after all that personal attention, what does God do when he gets angry? He creates a new way to show love and mercy toward mankind. And he said to his servant, "Turn away from those who rejected me and go out quickly to the streets where there are many kinds of people, and the lanes of the city where the needy and the underprivileged people feel most comfortable, and bring in the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame." And the servant said, "Sir, what you commanded has been done, and still there is room." There's room at the cross for you. Though millions have come, there's still room for one. Yes, there's room at the cross for you. And the master said to the servant, "Go out into the highways and hedges and compel people to come in. Go invite the highwaymen and the people who have no place to lay their head. Not forcing against their will, but strongly urging them to overcome their hesitance, their reluctance, and come, that my house will be filled." There is room for everyone. The custom of the day was not to start the feast until all the places were filled. "For I tell you, none of these men who were invited shall taste my banquet." Luke had just recorded Jesus' teaching about God's gracious invitation to enjoy the messianic banquet in the kingdom, that it was free for all who would respond. And Jesus taught elsewhere that responding meant believing on him. Now Luke recorded Jesus' teaching that though salvation is free, discipleship is costly. Salvation guarantees heaven, but it also calls for a complete commitment to Jesus, not to secure heaven, but to express gratitude for heaven. And so now Jesus leaves the meal and he's on the road again, and a great crowd accompanied him, verse 25, which pictures again how large the crowd following Jesus has become. Earlier we read thousands, and he turned and said to them, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciples." Curiosity is one thing, discipleship is quite another. Once someone was talking to a great scholar about a younger man, and he said, "So-and-so tells me that he's one of your students." And the teacher answered devastatingly, "He may have attended my lectures, but he was never one of my students." There's a world of difference between attending lectures and being a student. And it's one of the supreme handicaps of the church, that in the church there are so many distant followers of Jesus and so many few disciples. So the first qualification of discipleship is a willingness to give primary allegiance to him, even over your family and yourself. Verse 27, "Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." And then the second qualification of discipleship is a willingness to bear the burden of publicly identifying with Jesus, even if it means death. So now that Jesus has told the crowd the qualifications for discipleship, he uses the parable of a tower builder to tell them to count the cost of discipleship before they make their decision. And in doing so, he winnows down the crowd of onlookers to those who would be true followers, to those whom he would use to build his church, to those to whom he would entrust with the keys to the kingdom. Verse 28. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and he wasn't able to finish. So Jesus says, count the cost before becoming a disciple. Don't waste your time. Don't make a fool of yourself if you're not ready to commit to the qualifications. And then with a second parable, Jesus makes the same points, but he points out that the cost of failure is not just embarrassment, but personal destruction. So he uses the next parable to tell people that his invitation to discipleship is not just an invitation to a Sunday school picnic. It's an invitation to spiritual warfare. Verse 31. Or what king goes out to encounter another king in war and doesn't sit down first and deliberate whether he's able with 10,000 to meet him who's coming against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. So a person can be saved by accepting Jesus Christ as Savior, but a person will never follow and serve him until he's willing to make a sacrifice. That's what this passage has been teaching. There's a difference between being a believer and being a disciple. Unfortunately, not all believers are disciples. Then we come to the next story. Salt without taste is worthless. Salt is essential for life, and saltiness is one of the basic human tastes. Jesus says his disciples are like salt. And just as disciples can cease to follow Jesus, so salt can lose its saltiness. And in both cases, they become useless. Salt is good, verse 34. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It's thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. He who has spiritual ears to hear God speak, let him hear. And that's the end of the lesson for this week.